This podcast is brought to you by the Prospect Research Institute, a vibrant online learning community providing high-quality educational content, the opportunity to connect with peers, and an outlet for new ideas in the field of nonprofit fundraising research.
The future of our profession depends on us being able to interpret those kinds of larger trends for the organizations and to leverage those trends so that we can provide direction and tactics that can be undertaken by the field staff to really take advantage of what we see happening in the world.
Welcome to Prospect Research Chat Bites, a podcast by and for prospect research professionals. I'm Jennifer Filla. Today, I'm talking with Valerie Anastasio, Director of Prospect Development at Boston Children's Hospital Trust.
Hello, Valerie. Thank you for joining me today on Chat Bites.
Thank you, Jen. I'm happy to be here.
So when I take a look at your LinkedIn profile, I can see that you started your career as a frontline fundraiser. You were asking people to make gifts, and then you moved into prospect research. I'm wondering if you'd be willing to share a little bit about how that transition happened and a little bit about what your career's been like.
Sure. You're right, actually. I have had a long career. I started in the early 1990s, and like most people looking about 25 years ago, I didn't really choose development as a career profession. That career path wasn't that well defined back in the day. But I fell into it out of circumstance, which I think is fairly common, or was fairly common for folks that grew up at the time that I did in the profession. What I can say is that I started as a telemarketer for WGBH, which was our local NPR affiliate here in Boston, and that was part-time. And then I joined the research team at Brandeis University, which was my first full-time job. And my path since has been, I think it's been unusual in that I've worked and volunteered across a number of different nonprofit sectors. I've been involved in arts organizations and higher ed, medical research, private schools, membership organizations, conservation. I've dabbled even in international development a little bit and religious organizations on the volunteer level, and now I'm in healthcare, and I've worked in little tiny shops and to mid-size shops to mammoth shops, and this flipping back and forth between frontline or more externally facing roles and operational roles has really informed how I approach my work. I think I've dragged what I've learned from each previous experience into the next, regardless of whether or not it was a frontline thing or an operational thing. And so it's funny, people who haven't worked with me for a long time might hear me say things that are really unexpected for the role that I happen to be in at the time. It's not uncommon for them to look at me like I have two heads. But I think it's mostly because I have, for better or for worse, been in a lot of variety of roles and environments in my fundraiser past. And so I guess I speak from places where people don't expect me to have some kind of background in.
Ooh, that sounds like fun. So that really is quite a varied career, and it's almost like a consultant's career. You get to see sort of this broad, bigger picture. And in addition, you started prospect research at a time when a great reference book collection was a competitive edge. So I'm wondering, across that varied career and during the time of great technological change, what was it like to transform your work?
That's a really interesting question. That made me have to think all the way back into a time that I haven't thought about in a long time, Jen. That's really sort of fun. Looking back, it feels like it's always been this way. But the truth is that it was a large transition, and the transition didn't happen overnight. It happened in pieces, really. It was kind of a slow roll. And there was a reason for that. Let me tell you why. So, first of all, the World Wide Web, as we know it, and as some folks in your audience probably know, was developed in the early 90s, innovated really by Tim Berners-Lee, right? So he was the person who sort of set up the ability to use these URLs and the HTML format to pass or share information on this platform of networked servers in such a way. But so we had HTML format, this kind of markup language that allows us to incorporate images and audio and text together in one place. That was around, but we didn't have a browser, something that actually could interpolate those things at scale until like 1994. That was the first web browser. And we didn't really have a very high speed kind of backbone networking service support underneath that to support a lot of data transfer and the more bandwidth that we needed for that more complex data information, at high speeds until like 1995. And then we had to have legislation and law administrators and people to decide how these protocols would be handled and how things would be shared and that kind of thing. So the early adopters really were the academic folks and information services firms that supported them and libraries. So even though, having a really stellar print reference sources, as you say, was an important piece, a competitive edge, those were things that were accessible in libraries. And so in the early days, we did spend a lot of our time going to libraries to access those pieces of information that we couldn't afford to keep in-house. And that really didn't change for a while because technologically, in terms of the adoption of information and information in a format that could be accessed on the web, it still happens that the organizations that were out in front of that development were still the libraries and still those businesses that were set up to be able to interpolate. Now, in the 80s, the late 80s, some of your audience might remember dial-up services. America Online, AOL was active in the late 80s, and we would access large aggregated databases using our dial-up modem. They were slow. They had search syntaxes and things that you had to learn and study, and they varied depending on the information file. And all of that has improved over time as the information services like LexisNexis and Factiva and some of the large aggregators that are part and parcel of our profession, or sort of the standard hallmark tools of our profession, came online very quickly. But municipalities and government agencies that had public filings that you used to troop down to those offices to access, they were not digitizing very quickly. So for a while, you were straddling this world of being able to access interesting new things in a new realm. But you also had to supplement by your trips to the library and also your trips to those agencies. And even once they came online, for a while, maybe about 15 years really, there were still things that if you were researching a prospect that was in their 60s or 70s, a lot of the information that you might need to access to get a sense for who they were wasn't digitized and wouldn't be digitized. You were still going to have to go back to a microfiche or a municipal organization to get those old records, because certainly they had the money to implement Day Forward, but they weren't going to implement every single archival piece. They just didn't have the money or the bandwidth or the time. So I guess over time, even those past collections will improve, and you see it. There are some information services professionals out there. Kara Kalashane is one who does Research Buzz, and sometimes she'll say, hey, this has finally come online. We've had the web for 25 years, but finally this collection has been digitized so that it's available to us in this format. So it's a slower roll than you might have thought. And data is more recent and it's more available. But I think in hindsight, one of the things that being part of this transition has taught me in the wake of having all of this quick deliverable to us, some of what we have that we have to pay for, those gate charges, are different. But also there's a certain amount of skill and knowledge that I think has been lost to this new generation of researchers who are just learning it on this platform. Being able to understand and ferret out information really quickly and to be critical about it at the same time is an important feature, and it hasn't stopped being important. I feel lucky. I don't see the information that comes to us through the web and the aggregators as the only sources. And that was because of how I evolved in the profession and what was happening in the world of information services while I was part of that. The folks that are active now or are new now, you have to wonder how that might affect how they evaluate what they're doing and what they can know about the prospects that they're developing profiles on.
Well, and that's why I wanted to ask you about profiles. In our field, and I work with a lot of new researchers, training them.
Mm-hmm.
And just generally in the public, we use terms such as data, information, and analysis interchangeably. I'm wondering, why do you think it matters how researchers use those terms? And maybe what other words should we be eager to add to our lexicon?
Well, if we find we're using those terms, data, information, and analysis interchangeably, then it strikes me that we should revisit what we mean by the word profile. That term refers to an outline, usually biographical, of a person, which is a compilation of factual data. Maybe back in the day, that was what we did. We would collect these static pieces of data and put them together in a single place. But these days, our information world is so dynamic and it's so potentially broad that one has to consider what should be the scope, the boundary of the information that we would collect and put in a profile. How many facts need to be accompanied by the context so that we're actually not only reporting something, but also saying, this is what it means. They're a hedge fund manager for, a $200 million firm. What does that mean? That means it's a pretty darn small hedge fund because the really big ones are this size, that kind of thing. I think the profile has to provide a comprehensive picture, as comprehensive one as possible, of the prospect, but they simply can't be expected to be the solitary piece of due diligence that the organization undertakes in the process of engaging and cultivating. So they may inform, they might provide justification for strategy or approach, but ultimately, I think they are reference materials. And the best fundraisers I've worked with treat them as such. They don't rely on the profile exclusively. They're Googling too. They are working around the information that we provide them, sort of as the basis of that knowledge center. And the other thing that strikes me is that in the end, the process of creating the profile, at least the way that we budget it here, could take anywhere from 4 to 8 hours, maybe a little more. They become well acquainted, though, with that prospect, but it represents a lot of time that the organization has committed to the task of becoming knowledgeable about the prospect in the context of doing this directed document. So it's original, it's proprietary, it contains analysis, if it does, of any kind to arrive at a conclusion like a rating or a wealth estimate. It's a piece of business intelligence, competitive intelligence, and I think that it has to be treated as such.
Do you have examples, maybe in your own shop or something that you've heard of elsewhere, about how people are using profiles in innovative ways, given what you just said about how it's competitive intelligence?
I think innovation in the profile can take a couple of forms, right? It can take the form of how it's being pulled together, how it is formatted, how it's delivered, how it changes. I think the clearest profiles that I've seen are combining a lot of different elements now. They're combining tables with prose. They'll sometimes use photos. I'm aware that some organizations have developed templates through their own enterprise applications where, they keep information in tables and then they have big text fields for explanations of other things, and that they have developed internally a template that draws from those different areas of their enterprise application, and that's what they're putting forward. And increasingly, enterprise applications are giving you places where you can store photos and images and those kinds of things. But if I can think about the trends that might be out there, I would say that there's consideration for a balance between what you can present in a table, the name, rank, serial number kind of thing, that are standard for anyone that you would be researching, and then what requires some kind of explanation in the accompanying text. And the value of the prospect researcher is increasingly held in those explanatory areas. Though sometimes the greatest achievement is confirming an email or a phone number. You search for 2 hours and you finally find one. Then there's this element of social. When we think about the progression of the profile and the sources that we use, for the first time in history, really, we can often access self-published, the prospect published it themselves, firsthand information directly from them, on a Twitter feed, on the LinkedIn profile. And this is a dimension that has pretty much no precedent. So I think it's up for us to consider now how our profiles are sourced as much as what they look like.
So before I let you go, Valerie, if the transition to the internet was a pivotal time in our industry, what do you see as the next big transition for the fundraising research profession?
Wow. I mean, obviously I'm not a mind reader, but I can kind of tell you a little bit about the trends that I'm seeing out there. I think we are seeing, and it's hastening by technology and by the aggregators and the vendors that we use who bring us aggregated information around for prospects, the evolution of their tools and what they have available, as well as some of the necessities of doing business in our world now, the competencies that we need internally in order to meet the demands on our organizations, and that is cleaving our profession in two. That's kind of what I see happening, although it won't be perfect and it will probably be a slow roll, just like the transition from print to digital around our sources. And it's splitting between information and data. So what we do now as prospect researchers is so specialized, and we have competencies around a subject matter expertise that really isn't necessary to have in any other part of the development office, quite frankly. This is why we are a bird of paradise in a sea of daisies, but we are fantastic. But we have these very, very specialized competencies, and I think that we're going to be replaced, outsourced essentially, by research companies, by specialists who are parts of consulting firms who specialize to the industry. I know you have firsthand knowledge with your company with that. There are other companies like that. There are now information services companies that are developing full-on dossiers of people at a certain level of wealth, and you can contract and subscribe to them and order those up. Those things are increasing. Aggregators like our hallmark ones, Wealth Engine or Target or Donor Search or iWave, increasingly putting together the compilation of facts that they can find on a particular individual and or couple, and presenting that in the context of a format. I have to say that these are going to become more cost effective, and they're going to present a more competitive value for most organizations that have budgets under a certain level. It's given the choice between hiring a person who's a researcher and expecting them to know all the things that would make them a good quality researcher, or jobbing that specialty out to a company that specializes in aggregating and formatting. However, even if they use human researchers to do part of that work, and then delivering it to you is much more cost effective, and it really takes you off the hook of having to train and keep the quality high of that researcher and support all of the in-house tools that person's going to need. At the same time, that person that used to be a researcher is really going to need to be more data focused. The data needs are not going to go away. The subject matter expertise of the researchers around wealthy prospects and assets and wealth estimation is too specialized a skill, and it can be jobbed out, whereas an intimate understanding of your data in the database and how people like to have things sorted and checked and what those things mean is going to continue to be a need internally. And so our expertise is going to cleave into that. That's where you're going to see the rest of us as these internal officers that manage and leverage institutional knowledge on behalf of the fundraisers. They're the ones who are going to work very, very closely with the fundraising executives and the organizational leadership to assess the opportunities within a constituency, both for the near term and the long term gain. They're going to be the ones who convert the information that they get from these aggregators into meaningful and tactical opportunities. The future of our profession depends on us being able to interpret those kinds of larger trends for the organizations and to leverage those trends, the information that we see, the contextual information, so that we can provide direction and tactics that can be undertaken by the field staff to really take advantage of what we see happening in the world. And that's a more sophisticated, more thoughtful, more reflective, more analytical role. It may require some experience working really closely with fundraisers on the front line. But I think that alongside with everything else, our information revolution has elevated the value of information and, even more accurately, intelligence in our organizations, and that we'll see more dedicated staff that are there to help to back up and interpret and provide meaning for the field staff around opportunities that exist in the world, depending on where our constituencies lie and how our constituencies are connected to one another in the world.
Wow, that's a lot to think about. And you articulated that so well. I was so excited when you said that you would agree to an interview, and I am thrilled that you were able to share with us, Valerie. Thank you so much.
Oh, it was a pleasure, Jen. Thank you.
That was Valerie Anastasio, Director of Prospect Development at Boston Children's Hospital Trust. As we discovered in our conversation with Valerie today, our field is slowly evolving in response to the march of technology. To keep pace and stay ahead of automation, you need to network with your colleagues and share strategies. If you dream of a community where you can do just that, where you can grow your knowledge and skills through content, discussions, and activities, check out the Early Career Club. It's a private, online community for prospect research professionals just like you. Visit www.earlycareerclub.com to learn more.